All right, I have 5:30, so it's time to start our next installment of the Fall 2021 Tennessee Master Beef Producer Program webinar series. I'd like to welcome everybody back for this evening. It's been a couple of weeks, I think, since our last session. We've just had these kind of hit and miss through the fall, but glad you could join us. I see that there are a couple of questions in the chat and in the Q&A, and I'll get to those as soon as I introduce our speaker and let him start for this evening's presentation. But I'll get right to those. But thanks again for joining us back here. My name is Justin Reinhardt, an Extension Beef Cattle Specialist with the University of Tennessee Animal Science Department. Glad to be hosting you here this evening. So let me go through some of the normal startup type things, announcements that we do here. Just like to remind you that if you'd like to ask questions, specifically questions that relate to the presentation tonight, if you'll hit your Q&A box there at the should be at the bottom of your screen somewhere, depending on how you're watching this. And if you'll click that, then you'll be able to type a question in. I'll be able to see that as Andrew's speaking, and I can either answer that directly by typing the answer into the Q&A box, or I'll kind of curate those if need be and group them up into similar type questions and ask those to Andrew at the end of it when he's done, and we'll just have a conversation and try to address some of those questions. So certainly encourage you to do that. It helps us to speak directly to what you need, and I'll be watching those and try to keep up with them best I can. I don't think we're going to have any interactive questions this evening. I'll just also say that if you have questions, maybe technical questions about the platform or about the way we're doing Master Beef, you can type those in the chat. I also like to remind you that you can contact your county UT Extension Ag and Natural Resources agent, and they'll be able to help you with a lot of the things prior to and after these webinars. So we deliver the Master Beef Producer Program through your UT Extension agents, and they kind of administer the program there on the local level. So we'd refer you to them on any of the, procedural things that you need to ask about the Master Beef Producer Program in general. So with that, I'd like to introduce our speaker for tonight. Dr. Andrew Griffith is an Extension livestock marketing specialist. I almost said beef cattle specialist, Andrew. You kind of, I think you know enough about production, you can probably cover both ends of it, but he's hired as a marketing and ag economics specialist in ag and resource economics department at the University of Tennessee. Covers the whole state, doing livestock marketing demonstration, research, extension, education type work. He and I work together quite a bit, have written some publications together, and always just a pleasure to work with Andrew. And he's going to be talking to us tonight about marketing and the back to the basics types things. You see Andrew's education there, but I'm not sure that matters as much as real world education, and he'll give us plenty of that of what he does and what he knows. So with that, Andrew, I'm going to turn it over to you, and I'm going to start working the questions in the Q&A in the chat. All right.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Justin. I appreciate it. I appreciate y'all having me on and the opportunity to do this. Y'all saw my education, and I've been with the university. It'll be 10 years in May, I believe. And it's been good to be here and serve the state. I like to note the fact that I am in cattle production myself. Raise a few acres of soybeans, run a couple loads of stocker cattle, and then I also run some stock cows as well. But it's hard to know the exact demographics of the audience. And when I say demographics, I mean, where we are in production and who's doing what from this platform. But I'm gonna hopefully talk about some very basic marketing aspects that influence the price received for feeder cattle and overall profitability in an operation. Those things that are influencing those prices that are going to impact the profitability of an operation. And it seems like it is something that's very basic, but even producers that have been in the business for many years continue to ask the question, well, why did my calf not bring what my neighbor's calf brought, or some form of that question. And hopefully some of the information that I share here this evening will answer those questions and give participants a better idea of what's going on. So without further ado, I'll just go ahead and get started. It's, as an economist, we're constantly doing statistics and this type of math, that type of math, and there's really just one basic equation that people need to remember. And when it comes down to it, the profitability of your operation depends on the total revenue minus your total cost. And when we think about feeder cattle, it's typically the weight of that animal times whatever price is received. And I'm sure many of you have heard somebody say, well, yeah, I sold a calf for this price. And it seems like a very high price, and they're proud of how high that price was. But then when you get down to, well, how much did the animal weigh? Well, it was a 350-pound calf. And what we know in this business is as weight goes up, price tends to go down. But, when you multiply a 350-pound calf by $2 a pound, that's still only $700 for that calf. And so we have to remember that there is a price and a weight component and a total cost component in that. So just keep that in mind as we talk about things this evening. Some basic definitions I'm going to use. Stocker cattle, or anything that I perceive, anything under 600 pounds, I would consider a stocker animal. And then anything over 600 pounds, I'm going to put in the feeder category. Tons of ways to market animals. And I'm not going to say one's better than the other. It all depends on your situation. Justin mentioned writing publications, and I just started writing one today that has to do with new producers or even longtime producers considering different sectors of the cattle business. And so, in that, we have so many different marketing time periods. And many people in this state and across this nation are going to market calves at weaning. They're going to breed cows. They're going to keep them till 6 to 8 months of age, and then they're going to market those calves at weaning. And for some people, that's the correct thing to do, and for other people, that's probably not the correct thing to do. Then we have marketing calves after a preconditioning program, maybe even backgrounding those cattle to heavier weights, make them a true yearling calf. So, you go from a weanling calf of 7 months versus a preconditioned calf that might be 9 months old to a fully backgrounded calf that may be 11 to 12 months old. And then past that, we have the opportunity to finish cattle, whether that be on farm or in a custom feedlot of some sort. So there's several things that drive prices of feeder cattle. There's the genetic characteristics, which have been widely talked about in this state and are widely important from the standpoint of Tennessee Agricultural Enhancement Program incentives. There's management characteristics. There's marketing characteristics, market conditions, and external factors. So some basic genetic characteristics that you need to think about is just, one, the sex of the animal. You have heifers and you have bulls at birth, and you don't get much decision on the heifer, but the bull can also be castrated and become a steer, which is going to influence price. The breed of that animal, the color of that animal, which are very closely related. Granted, now we have about every type of black breed that there can be, because they've introduced the black hide color because of the advantage that CAB offers in the marketplace, certified Angus beef offers in the marketplace. But also we'll talk about muscling and frame size, which have a lot to do with the pounds that are sold and the efficiency of those animals. Management characteristics, what weight you sell those animals at. Like we mentioned earlier, as weight of a calf goes up, the price typically goes down. The health of that animal, a non-thrifty animal, an unhealthy animal will definitely be discounted relative to one that isn't. So, if you have a calf with active pink eye, it's going to be discounted. If you have a calf that looks like it's got worms, it's going to be discounted more than likely. If it looks like it has any type of issue, they're going to discount it. Might have warts on it, they'll probably discount it. Animals with horns will generally be discounted. The condition is in like flesh score of that animal will shift how that price looks. Marketing characteristics such as lot size, we know that the larger the lot, typically the higher the price. The uniformity of that lot is very important. The feel, whether they're tanked or not, or they're gaunt. We'll talk about those. And then just the general market conditions, the price of beef, the supply and demand characteristics, other input prices that go into finishing animals. And then we have other external factors that play into it. So when we think about all these factors that feed into feeder cattle prices, then we have to think about fed cattle prices, because they ultimately are where the beef supply and demand run. And so, supply comes primarily from fed, steer, and heifer slaughter. For instance, steer slaughter probably makes up right at 50%. Fed steer slaughter makes up 50% of all slaughter in our country. Heifer slaughter is probably closer to 30%. And the remainder of that's going to come in as commercial cow slaughter and bull slaughter and other type of slaughter as far as the slaughter concerns. But we also have those imports and exports that influence supply. When it comes to demand, I mean, that's the thing is that as an economist, you don't have to be an economist to know that every market works off supply and demand. And those are, we don't have to get any deeper than that, but consumers' disposable income influences what they demand from a beef standpoint. Total population is going to influence that. And so there's just several things that feed into total beef supply and demand, which then turns into what the choice or what the steer and heifer price is going to be. We do see some disconnect to some degree, but that has to do with leverage between cattle feeders and packers. And so that's kind of a secondary factor that we don't have much say so over. So here we can think about what we need to produce, when we need to produce it, and how to market and where to market. At the end of the day, if you go into this business without some type of plan, you'll probably fail, just like any other type of business that goes in without a plan. You don't start any type of, you might have a plumbing business or a welding business, or it might even be a convenience store. If you go in without a plan, it's more than likely going to fail. And so the same thing, I mean, the cattle production is a business, and it should be viewed as such. And so you have to know what you're going to produce to meet the market demand and how you're going to market those animals. So when we think about things to produce, I know that Justin is a huge proponent of crossbreeding, as I think most production animal scientists would be. From a commercial cow-calf production standpoint, crossbreeding is one of the most inexpensive ways we have to increase the value of our animals, and that's generally by having heavier animals to sell. And so something that we ought to think about, we with this whole certified Angus beef that has dominated the market since the early 2000s, we have a lot more straight line breeding in the Angus herd, but there are still some large advantages to crossbreeding. And as a stocker producer, I can say I have some good, I buy some good black animals that do very well, but across averages, my Charolais cross cattle and my red cross cattle tend to be more efficient and grow better than the black cattle on a percentage basis. You just can't get as many of them because most people are breeding for black animals and black hides. Group marketing can be very advantageous. What we know based off of observation and research is that loads commonly bring a $10 per hundredweight premium compared to selling singles. So being able to sell a full tractor trailer truck load or 50,000 pounds versus selling one at a time typically has a premium on it. And then you need to think of what breeds or crosses will actually help make those uniform loads. Now, getting a little back into that breeds section, you got to think about what feeder cattle markets you want to fit into. And from a quality, and when I say a quality market, I'm talking about quality standards as we grade beef: choice or prime, choice, select, standard. But typically our English breeds and our English continental crosses are going to grade better than just continental cattle. So, you know, we want to look for animals that'll grow, but we also want to look for animals that are going to grade choice or higher, because that's what the market demands. Select cattle, I do believe select grade beef is going to be left in the dust in the next few years. And so when you think of it from that standpoint, we definitely do need to be breeding and using our genetic selection to breed for animals that tend to grade well, because that's what the market demands for high quality grading beef. So being choice or prime. There are some other markets, the natural and organic market, and I'm not going to speak much on those, but that there definitely is a strong market for those animals. I do know a few buyers that buy natural and organic cattle, and they do bring very strong prices. So there is an opportunity there as well. From a standpoint of how we get information and what we have available to us, we think about where, what's the price going to be of an animal? Well, we use some communication tools such as market news, and if you have had an opportunity to read any of our Tennessee market highlights on a weekly basis, we put out highlights on a weekly basis, and that generally that information stems from market news reports. And the thing is that allows us to communicate across the entire nation and across the world. When I'm selling a number one muscled calf, that everybody understands what that number one muscled calf actually means. So that's what that's. We also use that same information to sort and grade cattle. It allows us to group those cattle such that if you're going to sell larger groups, that you have more uniform cattle. So when we think about feeder cattle grades, we typically grade cattle into three grades based off of well, I shouldn't say three grades. We have three grades for frame size, and then we have typically 4 grades for muscling. So we grade them based off of frame size and muscling. Frame size, we do large, medium, and small. Large being a steer that's expected to grade choice weighing over 1,250 pounds versus anything that's expected to grade choice weighing under 1,100 pounds would be a small frame, and heifers are 100 pounds back of that. Now, the thing with that is the way we grow cattle today, most of our cattle are going to be medium or large frame. And actually, most of them will be large frame cattle, because we finish most cattle weighing 1,350 to 1,400 pounds today from a steer standpoint, and 1,300 to 1,350 from a heifer standpoint. So most of our cattle are going to be considered large frame cattle. And you can look at over the years how the market has shifted from smaller frame to larger frame to a moderate frame. And then, so we hit extremes. But I would encourage you to keep medium to large framed animals. I would always be shooting for that 1,250 to 1,300 pound type animal to finish. That way you're never in the extremes. So when we think about frame size, it's all based off the animal's skeletal size. And it really has to do with how, even you can think about how humans grow. But if you're already in the cattle business, or if you're going to get in the cattle business and you're in the cow calf business, the thing of it is the first thing an animal grows is its bone structure. Just like humans, just like little babies, we grow a bone structure, and that is the frame size. And you'd be remiss to not think that muscling and frame size work together to some degree, because most of the time you're not going to have a really small framed person that has extremely heavy muscling. They can, it's not to say they don't exist, but they tend not to have as much muscling. And similarly, you can have some large frame people that don't have a lot of muscling, but they tend to have, on if we're doing a probability from a probability aspect, those people are probably going to have a little more muscling than those that are smaller frame. But it really has to do with the length of those bones and how large they get. So again, large frame would be animals that steers that are expected to grade choice weighing over 1,250 pounds and heifers 100 pounds back. Medium frame would be between 1,100 and 1,250 pounds, and small frame would be a steer that's expected to grade choice weighing less than 1,100 pounds, and a heifer less than 1,000 pounds. But from a dollar standpoint, I mean, this may seem like old information, but there was a really good study out of Arkansas where premium for large over medium frame calves, if they were over 400 pounds, there was no difference, but under 400 pounds, there was a $3 to $4 difference. But small frame cattle were discounted $22 relative to those large frame and medium frame cattle. So if you're going to put your animals through a traditional marketing, through a weekly auction market or through the traditional system, you want to stay away from small frame cattle because they're going to be heavily discounted because they're not going to grow as to be as big to be able to sell in the feedlot, and they're a lot less efficient on feed. If you're in the freezer beef business, that may be a good animal for you. It maybe even in the grass fed business, if you're going to finish cattle grass fed, Scottish Highlanders, Belted Galloways, those type of cattle tend to be smaller frame cattle. They will typically finish faster, and you can market those animals through that system quicker if that's something that you're willing to do. But if you're going to go through the traditional system, you definitely want a medium to large frame animal. And I did a little work on this myself in 2013, and the truth of it is these numbers have been consistent because I covered a lot of years, but typically small frame steers were discounted $15, $16 per hundredweight relative to medium and large frame steers in Tennessee for 500 to 650 pound steers, which is what most people typically sell in our state. Muscle score is exactly what it says. It's the development of that muscle, how thick that muscle is, how big does it get. The rounder it is, the more muscling that those animals tend to have. You're looking for a round muscle, and when we talk about beef, what are we eating? We're eating the muscle, and so that's what we're looking for. We have four different grades of muscling: 1, 2, 3, and 4. Probably some of the best things to be able to tell for muscling. If you look at the width between the two back feet, that will tell you a lot about muscling. As you can look at these 4 pictures, that you can see how a number 1 muscled animal, which is a desired muscling, I would always shoot for a number 1 muscled animal. There will be several number 2s that people produce, but that's not a terrible thing. Number 2s are not terrible. They're still good cattle, but you don't need, in a beef cattle herd, you don't need musclings of 3s and 4s. But you're looking for a very round rump muscle, and the farther, you can even tell at a young age how an animal is going to muscle based off of how far its back feet stand apart from each other. And a little saying I sometimes tell people is I say, if you can't see the gut because of the butt, then it's a good chance it's a number 1 muscle calf. If you can see some shades of that gut around the butt, then it's probably a number 2. And if you can see the gut and can't hardly see the butt from the back, you probably got a 3 or a 4. So those are just some things to think about, because we're always shooting for a medium to large framed animal that has number 1 muscling. That is where you will capitalize on your value. So now you can read as well as I can talk. But again, just looking at that rounded appearance throughout the entire animal on all the muscling. Don't be fooled if you're looking at an animal by a flesh on that animal. So fat cover sometimes covers up some of muscling, an inferior muscling. So if you take this number 2 animal and you put a little extra fat on him relative to a number 1 muscle animal that was in a 5 flesh score, if he was 6 or 7, buyers can see that flesh score, and they can tell that there's a additional fat cover. but don't be fooled by such things. Again, number 3 muscle cattle. Typically, our dairy cattle tend to be number 3 muscle cattle, and number 4 is just bad. But when we go back to that Arkansas study, number 1 versus number 2 muscle cattle, a discount on number 2 cattle of about $5 to $6 for 750 to 800 pound animals. And in Tennessee, the way they group cattle when they report cattle, they always group number 1s and number 2s together. So there was a $15 per hundredweight discount on number 3 muscle cattle relative to number 1s and number 2s. But you definitely will see number 1 muscle cattle bring a higher price than number 2 muscle cattle, because they're expected to perform better and be able to sell at a heavier weight just because they will grow bigger. I mean, it's just like any of these athletes that you see. You can tell which ones are more heavily muscled than others. And, you go to a football field or you go to the basketball court or whatever it is, and they have, they're carrying more weight in a smaller package than essentially, for lack of better terms, a fat person. And so that structure is what we're looking for. Then to pile on top of that, this is all information that's used when people are describing cattle to sell, and the information that people are using when a calf walks into a sale ring. If an individual, they're going to look at that, they're going to notice that frame score, they're going to notice that muscling. They're also going to look at the flesh score. So if you're familiar with body condition scoring cows, which is on a 1 to 9 basis, flesh score is a very similar scale. And so most of the time we're looking for cattle that are in a 5 to 6 flesh score. That means they're typically in a healthy flesh score. That doesn't mean that it's bad to have 4s or 3s. I actually sold a load of stocker cattle that were in 3 to 4 flesh. And some people would think they were just in terrible condition and this, that, and the other. Well, the thing is those 3s and 4s had only been on grass, and whoever bought those cattle could expect those cattle to gain tremendously, because they weren't bad cattle. They just had not been fed a bunch of $6 corn yet. So, it's not bad, but we don't necessarily always want it. They would typically, if they're healthy cattle, thinner cattle will bring a higher price, but that doesn't mean that's what's best. A 5 that you want to be shooting for that 5 to 6 flesh score, and 5 is probably where most feeder cattle need to be hitting. But based off the Arkansas study again, very thin cattle, which are considered to typically have some type of health issue, they're gonna be heavily discounted. Thin cattle, which would be those 3s and 4s, may receive a premium, but I'm not going to say that that's what you want to do, because $2 a hundredweight may not be satisfactory to overcome what additional weight could have been put on those cattle to be more profitable. Fleshy cattle, so those that are probably 6.5, 7s, discounted $6 a hundredweight, and then fat cattle, fat being 8 or 9 flesh, discounted $14 per hundredweight. Now, I will say these premium and discounts for flesh score will vary throughout the year. As you go into the spring, fleshier cattle will be discounted even more than in the fall. This time of year, it doesn't hurt to get some flesh on cattle, because if you're bringing in high-risk cattle, it's good for them to already have some fat reserves, because you might be dealing with some transitions as they transition from coming straight off of the cow into a stocker cattle operation. So being a little fleshy in the fall, heading into winter, is a lot better than being fleshy heading into February and March, when a lot of people are going to be buying grass cattle and they're not going to perform that well. In fact, fleshier cattle are not going to perform well on grass as thinner cattle will. So all these things determine these factors. A male calf generally brings a steer is going to bring a higher price than a bull. A steer is going to bring a higher price than a heifer. A lot of times, if they're the same weight, a lot of times we still see bull prices and heifer prices very close for the same weight. The actual weight's going to influence it: frame, muscle, flesh, feel, load lots, the color, the background, breed genetics. We're actually starting a study with feedlots in our department to evaluate what they're willing to pay for feeder cattle genetic tests, to know what genetics are behind these animals and how they might perform in the feedlot. Some of these other management things, preconditioning, vaccination, castration, and dehorning, all those things in the total health of the animal. A study back in 1993 by Dr. McLemore, Dan McLemore, shows some heavy discounts on a lot of animals throughout the state. These, I don't know if these percentages are exactly the same as they were in 93, but I guarantee you they still hold. All these animals are still discounted, and they may even have be a bigger percentage now than what they were then, just because of the number of dollars that are invested in cattle today relative to 1993 and the risks that are involved. So let's think about some production considerations for just weighing cattle. Those are all, we just talked about a lot of things that influence the price, but at the end of the day, there's other things that influence our total revenue generated, and the weight of that animal is very important. So shrink, some people that are on tonight will be familiar with shrink. Others may not be familiar with shrink. And it's very important to know what it is. So shrink just in general is just any type of weight loss when cattle are held off feed and water. So that happens when you gather the cattle. That's when you market the cattle, when you transport the cattle. You think about freshly weaned calves. If you get them out of the pasture this afternoon, and you're going to haul them to the sale in the morning, well, that if they're off the cow, they're shrinking from the time you get them off the cow till they actually walk across the scale in the sale ring. And so those animals are not going to have eaten anything or drank anything, because the only thing they're going to be looking for is for mama. And so anything that causes a stress to an animal is going to likely lead to some type of shrink. So another way to think about it is just that output exceeds input. So most of our typical shrink comes from fecal or excretory shrink. So manure and urine are going to be the main things. And y'all know how it is. As soon as you put any animal on a trailer, the first thing they start doing is pooping and peeing. And you'll have a trail the whole way to the sale barn of those animals urinating and defecating. And then you have a trailer to clean out when you get back home. And the thing of it is all that urine and fecal is actual weight. And now you can't sell it because it's gone. It's not unavoidable, but animals that can get to the sale barn and then can actually get a drink of water or eat a little bit of the hay that's made available to them will at least put some of those pounds back into the digestive system of those animals. A more problematic type shrink is tissue shrink, and that tends comes from loss of fluid from the body. Tissues generally associated with sickness. Just think about when you as a person get sick. You're not hungry, you're not thirsty, but the one thing the doctor always tells you is, drink plenty of fluids, And the same thing with animals. When they're sick, they don't tend to want to consume much water. We'll end up with dry noses. That's a sign of a sick animal, dry noses. Hopefully you catch sickness before it gets to that point. But it does occur. And so anytime you have tissue shrink, it's going to increase the chances of further sickness and morbidity and mortality altogether. So the factors that affect this shrink, think about the length of time off of feed and water. There's times when we can't avoid keeping animals off of feed and water because of what we're doing. But for those people that take calves straight off the cow, I would highly encourage you not to deliver those calves to the market the day before the sale. Because those animals, if you get them up today, you got them up when you got home, and then you hauled them to the sale. Actually, there's probably people right now hauling freshly weaned calves to the sale for tomorrow. And those calves are going to sit there and they're going to bawl all night. They're just going to be vocal all night and all day. And they're finally going to walk across the scale 16, 18 hours after they were pulled off of their dam. And they're going to have lost a lot of weight, which means a lot of pounds missed out on selling. So, you get them off the cow, you put them on a trailer, They don't drink any water, eat any hay. You haul them a long way. Then they're sorted and handled by people they're not accustomed to. All those things affect shrink. Extreme temperatures, especially think about extremely hot weather per se. You know, the last thing cows want to do is get out from underneath the shade tree and move when it's extremely hot. And higher temperatures are just going to continue to increase that shrink, especially if those animals are coming off of endophyte infected fescue. And of course, that can lead to increase in tissue shrink and other sickness. More things that can lead to shrink coming straight off of lush green grass. When you sell cattle off of spring grass, you know how that runs right through them, and that will increase shrink. Crazy cattle, you know, if you have one crazy one, you know how it is when you walk in the field. She gets that periscope head and she starts looking around and she's looking at you. And if you take 3 steps forward, even though you're 300 yards from her, she takes off. And then what happens to the rest of them? Well, a lot of the other ones take off. And then if you do get them caught, they're all stirred up. And if you're selling one that's crazy, it affects itself worse, but it affects all the others at the same time. So that just increases shrink, increases shrink, which means fewer pounds to sell. Over and undercrowding a trailer can injure, you know, anything that increases stress. I like to liken this to using an elevator. Most people will have had used an elevator at some point in their life. And if you've ever been in that situation where you punch the little button to go into the elevator and all of a sudden you start to walk in and there you can't even turn around. There's so many people in the elevator, because the normal thing to do is to walk in the elevator, put your back to the back and look like you're fixing to walk out the door. But y'all have all seen those elevators that have been so packed that you can't get in edgewise. And just because your trailer will hold 15 calves doesn't mean you need to squash 18 calves on there, because that you say, well, I'd have to make an extra trip and that's going to cost money. Well, that may be a better option than trying to squash 18 calves on a trailer that'll only hold 15 of that size. Undercrowding can also be a problem, as you know, if you get in there and you have too much room, just similar to you have one animal in one cut and you have to slam on the brakes, and more than likely you throw that animal down on the ground, which could break a leg, could injure the animal in some form or fashion. Whereas if they're properly crowded in that trailer, they'll just kind of push up on each other and they won't fall down. So it's important to use your cut gates so that animals are properly crowded. You know, all these things lead to shrink. Think about, you gather them at home, then you sort them at home to get the calves away from the cows. Then you put them on a trailer and you haul them, and then they get sorted again when you get them to the sale barn, and then they're commingled with some other cattle and put in a new environment. Then they're off of feed and water. All these things increase in stress, increase in shrink. And so those things are going to reduce to fewer pounds sold. So we've talked about these things that impact price. Now we're talking about these things that impact the weight of cattle being sold, all going to influence those total returns to the animal. Most time, the greatest amount of shrink occurs early on, first 3 to 4 hours, but they're going to continue to shrink the longer they're off of feed and water. And shrink will definitely increase when they're being hauled. Weigh in versus weigh out markets. Most of our markets are weigh out markets, but you can take the feeder calf sale in McMinnville, for example. Some of the Tennessee Beef Alliance sale, they are actually weigh in markets. So animals coming in and being weighed off the trailer will typically be a little heavier than cattle that stand around and don't have any hay or water to consume. So that's something else to think about. Prices generally are higher for weigh out markets than weigh in markets. And there's good reason for that, because they have a more shrunk animal. And so that animal should put back on that weight more quickly. So that's why the price would be higher for a weigh out market versus a weigh in market. Ways to reduce shrink. Avoid keeping those calves off of feed and water for long periods of time. And don't deliver cattle to the market the day before the sale. If they're weaned and preconditioned cattle, it's not as big of an issue. You can go ahead and take those cattle. They'll be put on feed and water, and they'll be okay. But freshly weaned calves, it's going to be tough. And just try to reduce stress as much as possible. We as human beings don't like to be stressed, and these animals also don't like to be stressed. So, there's several ways we can manage this. Wean and preconditioning prior to marketing will definitely reduce some of that shrink. Feeding some hay prior to marketing. Hay tends to work more slowly through the digestive tract than grass does. So feeding some hay will really help in this situation. And just try to learn how to handle cattle appropriately. Justin and I work out of an office with Kevin Thompson, who does a lot of educating on low stress handling, similar to Ron Gill out of Texas A&M and others. There's several people that teach low stress handling, and it is very, very beneficial. Not only does it reduce shrink, low stress handling makes cattle a whole lot easier to work, And I am a witness to that, because when I bring in cattle from who knows how many different farms, getting those cattle accustomed to me and knowing that I'm not a threat is very beneficial. And if you stress those animals, they're going to think you're a threat all the time. So gone animals, which would be considered kind of thin cattle, and shrunk cattle generally bring a higher price than fuller tank cattle. It's a shame that you don't want gone or shrunk cattle. You want average feel and average on the animals. You just want something good and average. But there are people that will say, well, I'm going to feed these calves a little salt, and that way they'll drink a lot of water. And the thing is buyers recognize that. Buyers recognize when these cattle are overfull, and they're going to discount them. And typically they're going to over discount them to make up for somebody trying to fool them. So, it's not just looking at a price thing. We need to look at both price and weight, and consider the cost that it takes to get to that certain weight and what price we may receive. You got to think about the seasonal price movements all at the same time, because seasonality of prices are very important. We typically have the highest prices in the spring for calves. Why? Because we have a low supply of calves in the spring. Most people actually calve in the spring and then market in the fall. So prices for freshly weaned calves is typically lowest in the fall, because supply is so high, and because feed is going to be more expensive during the fall and the winter. Whereas when we get to spring, we get that spring demand or grass fever demand, because we have people with a lot of grass, and then we have a limited supply of grass cattle. However, yearling prices tend to be more stable throughout the year. The heavier the animal gets, the more stable the price gets, but there's still a seasonal component to all weight classes. So here's some information, the most up-to-date information for 4 to 5 weight, 6 to 7 weight, and 7 to 8 weight steers in Tennessee. And you can see the 4 to 5 weights have a larger variation throughout the year. So the way to read this graph is, for instance, 4 to 5 weights, in March, 4 to 5 weight steer prices tend to be 7 to 8% above the annual average, whereas in October they tend to be about 7% below the annual average. So really, really big swing. Whereas if you look at the 7 to 8 weight cattle, through the first 8 months, 9 months of the year, they tend to be above the annual average, and then they kind of slip in the last quarter of the year, but they're still no more than 2 to 3% below the annual average. So, and if you looked at finished cattle, it would even be less of a difference throughout the year if we were looking at 1,400 pound finished cattle. So, sometimes if you're a new producer, or you're looking to a controlled or defined calving season, which is encouraged as well, instead of having calves year round, you might consider some of this price seasonality. We did some research a few years ago with some data out of Ames, Plantation, and it showed that fall calving herds tend to be a little more profitable than spring calving herds. Now, I'm not going to say that's the case for every producer in our state. I think there's more things to consider than what we considered in that research. That research primarily considered the weight at which these animals were weaned, the calving percentage of fall versus spring. So we typically had more calves coming out of the fall calving herd than the spring calving herd. And then just prices during those typical marketing periods. So there's other things to consider. You know, if you have some type of business that really demands a lot of attention at certain times of the year, well, then you kind of have to think about how your cattle herd fits into that. When do you need to define calving season so that you're not overtaxed with both, both your side biz, your cattle business and the other business that you operate or that you work for. Just some things to think about. Price declines as weight increases. That's something we already talked about. And then heifer prices decline less than steers as weight increases. We know that heifer prices are discounted to steers, but as you go from a calf all the way to a finished animal, heifer prices as a finished animal are typically about the same as steer prices. So as they get farther in the production cycle, that discount becomes less and less because the discount is primarily based on their efficiency with feed, and they're less efficient than steers. Heifers are less efficient than steers. And the heavier they get, the less that the next person has to deal with that inefficiency. So when they get to actual harvest or slaughter, prices are typically about the same, though the heifers will end up being a lighter weight than steers in most cases. So also using seasonality for cull cows. This time of year, again, is typically the lowest price of the year for cull cows. And it's very important to market cull cows appropriately because they make up 15 to 20% of total revenue in a year. And they have a huge variation throughout the year. So if you look at this 2011 to 2020 data, there's nearly there is a 20% variation in prices from this time of year to when those prices tend to peak in the May-June time period. So if you're weaning calves right now and you're saying, well, I don't want to carry these cows through the winter, again, that's something else to think about is you're going to be selling them on what's typically the lowest market in the year, though they've been strong most of this year. We can talk about cost of gain and value of gain, but I'm gonna move over that for right now. So thinking about all of our different alternatives, we can market them at home, private treaty, which takes knowledge of what you actually have. So knowing what their muscle is, knowing what their frame score is, knowing what the true market is. Private treaty is not for everybody. It takes a lot of knowledge to be able to do that. We have weekly auction markets, which tend to be what is most used by most producers. We have graded feeder sales, we have alliance sales, video and internet sales, and some people that will retain ownership into the feedlot. So the thing is you really need a plan for your marketing. You don't just do this willy-nilly and say, well, I've produced something, now what am I going to do with it? You really need a plan for that. So don't go in this thinking, well, I can just raise some cows and I can just sell them. I guess you can, but it doesn't mean you'll make a profit. And you want to avoid these fads going too far one way or the other. Perform management practices that are cost effective. You know, something like a calf hood implant. There's plenty of research that has demonstrated that a calf hood implant that costs you $1.50 to put in the ear of an animal will gain you 15 to 20 pounds on that animal, which is probably the most cost-effective thing that we can do. Deworming calves is spring-born calves, I should say. Deworming spring-born calves has also been proven to be profitable for producers. Learn the seasonal price patterns. Know where we are in the cattle cycle. We're going to probably have a reduced cattle herd size come January 1 again. So we're looking at higher prices probably in 2022 than we are in 2021. Look at all your alternatives. You don't always have to do the same thing every year. A lot of people get in a rut and they want to do the same thing over and over and over and over because they think that's the right thing. Well, it's because daddy did it and granddaddy did it. And now that's just what I've always done. And look at your options every year, see what might fit you best. Know how shrink impacts weight and prices. It's important to know where your weight is being gained or lost. And evaluate each stage of production, determine if retained ownership fits the operation. That's actually what this publication I'm writing, I just started today, is going to talk about is, what stages of production should you be a part of? Is cow-calf right for you? And if it is, well, then how far should you carry those animals? If it's not, then what sector should you be in? And another thing is establish a good reputation for yourself and your cattle, because buyers know who you are. If I put in an order for cattle and I get somebody to buy cattle for me, a lot of our auction markets will provide information of whose cattle these are. And those order buyers know if those cattle do well or don't do well, just like I know if those cattle do well or don't do well. And so I know if there's cattle that I want to buy again versus cattle that I don't want to ever buy again. So you can build a reputation, and that will generally result in stronger prices if you have a good one, and lower prices if you have a bad one for cattle that don't perform. So with that, I'll stop sharing and I'll open it up for questions.
All right, thanks, Andrew. We've got several good questions, and I want to be the first to thank you very much for leaving plenty of time for questions. I think we get a lot out of that on this, especially when a lot of questions come in on the chat and the Q&A box. So I appreciate that. Some of the others we've cut a little close on time and didn't get to ask a lot of questions. So I'm going to kind of go back up through here and look. One that really popped out to me was a producer that I know. Let me scroll down through here so I can ask it just like he asked it in his question, if I can find it. Yeah. So talking about preconditioned calves, they ask, why do we continue to see Tennessee market not rewarding preconditioned calves? So in my mind, several reasons that may be. Some may be the method of marketing. Some may be the market it doesn't give the cues for a buyer to pay more for those kinds of things. Just in general, what are some reasons you see that weaned and preconditioned calves don't bring what we think they're worth, I guess?
Well, I don't know that I'm going to say that we don't see weaned and preconditioned cattle bringing what they're worth. Because I think typically if you look at our market reports, those value-added cattle, which typically in Tennessee are weaned and preconditioned, that there's a definition to be considered value-added if you're looking at the weekly auction market report. But typically in Tennessee, that means they're weaned and preconditioned. And we do typically see a higher price for those animals over the same weight animals that aren't. But I can tell you, I'll give you a, for instance, as an experience. I bought 140 calves last November and December. 7 of them died. 6 of those were preconditioned, vaccinated, and weaned cattle. I lost 6 out of 42. 42 of the cattle were weaned and preconditioned that I purchased. I lost 6 of those. I lost 1 out of the other 98. So at some point, you start to wonder if what people are representing is really truthful. And so that kind of goes back to that reputation. For instance, I bought some cattle out of the auction market that had 1 round of vaccine, unweaned. bought, I don't remember how many out of that group. I'd had to, never had the first problem out of any of them. I put a second round in them. I was the one that weaned them. No problem. But then I had this group that I lost 6 out of 42 that were weaned and vaccinated cattle off of multiple farms, but still that's, so sometimes it's better just to pay, take the risk on cattle that nobody said anything about than those that have said they've done something. Granted, I vaccinate all of them regardless if somebody told me they have or hadn't.
Yeah, so a lot of it just comes down to at what price they can buy them at in that market.
Yeah, but typically we still see a premium for preconditioned cattle.
And maybe the biggest thing there is how we market those, right? If you just take them to a normal run, middle of the day, and you've got a small group coming through and they say they're weaned and preconditioned, but it's in the middle of a bunch of individuals or some, just a regular run, maybe that's not where you get the buyers looking for those.
That's exactly right, Justin. I mean, at the end of the day, if you come in and you brought 5 preconditioned calves in, or maybe you brought 10 in, and then they have a weight, they have a weight range of 150 pounds. Well, how many of those are going to actually be sold together? What me buying a couple or 3 preconditioned cattle to go with a bunch of higher risk cattle, probably not going to pay that much more for them because I'm not gaining a whole lot from a couple of individual animals.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to move on to some, so, we're calling this a back to the basics kind of a series. I want to cover some of the basics. I know we have some folks on here that have, let me know through the chat and the Q&A over the last few sessions that they are very new to the business. So here's one that's, may be considered basic, but some people have been in for a long time, may not know, but why are colored calves docked over black calves? So hide color, can you just talk a little bit more about how that makes a difference in perceived value?
So I mentioned in my presentation certified Angus beef, and that is really what dominates the meat market. So certified Angus beef, you had to have a black-hided animal. At least 51% black-hided or something like that, whatever it was. It can be a black-white face, but it has to be primarily a black-hided animal. And most of those genetics came from the Angus breed, the black Angus breed. Well, the certified Angus beef, if you look at beef prices, I don't want to get too deep in the weeds, but I told you how we have prime, choice, select, standard. Well, then we also have what they call branded beef. Certified Angus beef is a branded beef, and it's upper 2/3 choice or higher. Granted, it just only be upper 2/3 choice because if it grades prime, it's going to have a higher value. But because of the potential, if it is a black-hided animal, it automatically has the potential to be in the certified Angus beef brand, whereas a red-hided animal or a white-hided animal or a brown-hided animal do not have, it doesn't matter how well they grade. They can be in the upper 2/3 choice, but they will never be certified Angus beef because they don't meet that hide color requirement. So the one thing about a black hide is it's guaranteed what's visually on the outside already meets that standard.
Yep.
So that premium filters all the way back down, all the way to the calf market.
It's interesting to me. It's one of the things that does filter all the way back to the cow-calf producer. There are a lot of things that might be marketing premiums in other points of trade in the beef production chain that don't necessarily get all the way back to the cow-calf producer, but this is one that does.
That and Justin, that's why we wrote our grant. Myself and a couple of my colleagues, or three of my colleagues, I guess, wrote that grant to try to figure out how feedlots view feeder cattle genomic testing, because if we expect those, things that don't filter back tend to be feed efficiency and actual how those cattle will grade. I mean, yeah, if they qualify for CAB, that may, but if I've got cattle that may grade prime and that's what the genetics say, or they have this great growth potential or whatever it is, we want our cattle producers at home to be able to capitalize on that if cattle feeders use that information. And we've actually seen Superior Livestock just had a sale that had several cattle that had been genomic tested, and it did show some premiums for cattle that had genetic testing behind them.
Yeah.
So we're going to survey 1,000+ feedlots and see what they actually say.
Yeah. And a lot of those things, even if they do get back to the point of origin or the cow-calf producer, that they still have to, like we were talking about in the previous discussion, still have to be marketed correctly, right? I mean, so if you've got 5 calves you're selling in a group, or maybe even 10, but it's less than a load that have genomic testing on them, and it's just a random sale, the buyer might not be ready to put those with other calves that have the same information. There's just not going to be any value to that. It's a lot of these things, seems to me anyway, really only come into play when you're able to not even just a load lot, but usually at least a load lot, 50,000 pounds of calves at a time, but sometimes a full feedlot pen, and that might be more to actually get that value off of it.
Correct. Well, so that's exactly right. Most of the time, because these guys are working in truckload lots because their pen size is maybe 70 cattle, maybe 140 cattle, maybe 300 head in a pen. And, but we do have producers in our state that have high quality grading cattle that are small producers, and they can use that information to market freezer beef. And if you're going to have an animal that grades prime, there's a market in our state for that higher quality beef that people are willing to pay for. And so, so if you're going to go that direction, if you do have those smaller groups, maybe that is how that could help you if you want to market it, because we got more and more people that are marketing freezer beef now.
Yeah. And I might just, before we get too far away from that set of question, I'll just make a couple of extra comments here, if you don't mind, on that black-hided versus other color hide marketing discrepancy. It's pretty standard, some of it I wonder about if it's because they can, or if that's an actual perceived value difference, but it's been in place so long, and it's been such an effective marketing tool on the other side, on the final product, that it trickles back. And if you think of this in the perspective of other industries, even outside agriculture, it's a pretty strange phenomenon that's been in place so long and so effective that other breeds of cattle have tried to turn black-hided to meet that market. That's a testament to some good marketing, whoever started that. And I mean, I know who it is, but it's just one of those things that's a heck of a slick deal, if you want to say it that way, that it worked that well. But I'll also say too that, there's some questions on here about, why does a smoked calf or a Charolais sired calf bring more than a actual black-eyed calf? You've already gone over that to meet those criteria. One is more than 50% black-hided, a certain ribeye area size, doesn't show any ear, doesn't show any dairy character. So that some of those things are things you can kind of estimate when you're buying feeder calves to make them at least have everything that you can see fit, so they might be able to hit that premium on the other end. But I will say too that back on the heterosis deal, and I appreciate you saying I'm a huge fan of heterosis in commercial cattle, just from the reproductive management side. But also, if you do it right, and that you've got 2 calves standing there, one let's say it's a smoked calf, and you got a straight bred black calf at the same age, and there's 7 cent or $7 hundred difference, but one of them weighs 70 pounds more than the other. I might take 7 less and 70 more pounds on the same age animal with the same inputs and still be money ahead. So I guess what I should say is kind of going back to a very fundamental basic principle of cattle marketing. unfortunately, we always talk about price per pound or price per hundredweight, but that's not what tells you how much money you're going to make. It's how many dollars did that cow return to you that made that calf. So a 7-cent difference on a 70-pound difference in weaning weight from the same cow, just bred different. It does. I'll take 7 less on my dollars per pound and take more on that total calf and total inputs than I would chasing just a, high color and giving up weight and weaning percentage and everything else doing it.
Another thing that feedlots want as uniform load of animals as they can get. They want them to be as uniform, and that includes color. To be honest, if I could buy 140 smoked cattle today that were uniform in size, I would do it. Mm-hmm. But the problem is I generally cannot buy that many, or some rednecks. I mean, I generally cannot buy enough redneck cattle or Charolais cross cattle to fill a tractor trailer truck load that are going to be similar. It takes such a long time to put those, or they have to come from such a wide breadth of area to put those together. And that's something else that buyers are looking at. I think there's a lot of people that would be tickled to death to buy 140 or 200 head of Charolais cross cattle and grow them out, but they just can't put them together quick enough to make it work.
Yeah. So I'm going to go back to some other basic things. There's a couple of things I really want to make sure I address. I'm just kind of keeping myself straight here because there are several questions on each of them. I do want to go back to shrink. That's an important one to me. I think there's no telling how many hundreds of thousands of maybe millions of dollars in cattle trade that is lost and gained on one side or the other just on shrink. And such an important thing to me. I had a question come in about, maybe older cattle shrinking less. Would it be okay to take older or maybe they're saying weaned cattle, preconditioned cattle, the evening before the sale? Maybe just speak to that. Well, I'll tell you what I think the answer is, but you can tell me if I'm right or wrong. But at any weight, they're going to shrink the gut feel, just over the same amount of time as most any other. A light kind of stressed calf is going to evacuate gut feel quicker, but unless you just if you take them overnight, they're going to lose gut feel, and that's going to be 6%, 5% at least.
Yeah, I don't care if it's a cow. I don't care if it's a yearling calf that's been weaned and preconditioned. A preconditioned calf is not going to lose as much because they will eventually, if they're there long enough, they're going to eventually drink and eat the hay, drink water and drink. But that's not all of them, because you can even see where somebody brings in a cow to their farm, and what do they do for a couple of days? They just walk in the fences. So same way, when you haul them into a stock barn, they're like, well, I'm in a new environment. Why am I here? So so they even will not eat as much or drink as much. Even a 5 or 6 year old cow is not going to eat or drink as much, and so she's going to lose more weight. So I'm sorry if y'all hear the helicopter outside.
It's not coming through very much.
Okay, it's air evac is what it is.
Oh, yeah,
right
sure.
Outside the house.
They're not searching your place or anything, right?
No, they take them down to Erlanger in Chattanooga, I think.
Gotcha. Or
whatever it's called. But I can see it and hear it. But anyway, that shrink is going to affect every animal. And actually, the bigger animals have more weight to lose because they have so much more gut feel. Percentage-wise, it may not be as great, but it's still a lot of pounds. The bigger that gut feel, the more pounds they can lose. So I always encourage people to take cattle the day of the sale. Always.
Yeah. And that, a lot of people aren't privy to see it, I guess, but just depending on how big a scale you operate on. But I've been a part of and seen stories where, selling on pencil shrink and the cattle shrink by the time they get to where they're going more than what what the seller indicated they would, and right back on the truck and they call you, say, oh, it's not the deal I bought. They're headed back. You figure out what to do with them. And that's a tough situation to be in.
Yep.
See, another big question that came up too, and several folks asking, and this is one I understand, if folks are new to cattle production, may not be familiar with, but you'd mentioned implants, growth promoting implants. And if you want me to, I can talk to the physiology and stuff, or if you want to take it, as much of it as you want, or we can just kind of tag team and maybe just give a very basic indication of what growth promoting implants are and how to use them.
Well, you go ahead and give the production side of it as you see it, and then I'll add in or fill in gaps that I think are necessary.
Okay, yeah. So to go to the very basics, just explain what it is. So growth promoting implant is either a pellet or a group of small pellets that you put under the skin on the back of calf's ear. And so they have steroids usually, or steroid analogs in those that get out into the calf's blood system and promote the development of muscle, usually for muscle accretion. So you get heavier weights from that. It takes their genetic potential, or it takes them further in their genetic potential to grow muscle and total pounds, but mostly in the form of lean muscle mass. And if it's your first time hearing about that may be very strange to hear that. Us been in cattle business, around the cattle business for a long time. It's just a tool that we use. There's a lot of, and this is kind of where we start getting into, science versus perception. And there's that gray line's getting grayer and bigger all the time. So I'll just try to give you the science as we know it. So these are, again, I mentioned they're based off of steroids, and that's the way the growth is promoted. But you don't have to be scared of the word steroid. We make steroids every day at different levels through our life, and different levels relative to whether you have a Y chromosome or not. And the steroids or steroid analogs used in these growth promoting implants are very, very, very low dose. It doesn't take much to stimulate more muscle accretion, and they're cleared very quickly. And so that's the other thing. They don't leave residue in the product or anything, but it's literally the same kind of thing that we make naturally, that all biological or all mammals do make in some form or fashion. All steroids start out as a molecule of cholesterol, and there are enzymes that change that molecule of cholesterol to different steroids down a pathway. Sometimes they go all the way to estrogen. Sometimes they stop at testosterone or progesterone, or one of the primary brands of growth promoting implants would be tremalone acetate. I believe it's a steroid analog, but those are cleared. You don't find any traces of them. And so if you actually look at estrogenic activity, and that's, these are more based on estrogenic than testosterone-like activity. If you were to measure the estrogenic activity in a cut of beef relative to cabbage is going to have fold higher levels of estrogenic activity than a cut of beef from an implanted calf. And you wouldn't even be able to tell the difference, measure the difference, unless you had the finest tuned steroid assay that I've ever heard of, the difference between an implanted and non-implanted calf. So I kind of went down a rabbit trail and talking about the safety of those, cleared by FDA, USDA, all that. So safe for the food supply, but they're very important to producing the amount of lean protein that we need to, for the population, both domestic and export. So that's kind of a quick explanation of the science and production side of it. But if you want to say anything else about the marketing.
Well, I generally don't get that in depth when I describe them. I just call them a synthetic hormone, because they really mimic some naturally produced hormones. That's what they're made to do. And like Justin said, they're there to create more lean beef, and they're very efficient at doing it. Um, they can be used anywhere from calf hood through the backgrounding phase into the finishing phase. And if an animal goes through the commercial finishing phase, I guarantee you they are receiving implants, because it is a very inexpensive way of producing lean muscle mass, which keeps your beef cost in the store relatively low compared to what it would be if we didn't have those. Um, you could kind of couple that with that beta agonist, another feed ingredient that's used to promote lean muscle mass. Um, and so there's a lot. I use them in the stocker business. I use them in cow calf operation. Um, you know, some have about a 70-day active uh, time. There's some that have 200-day active time. Uh, so very, very beneficial to reducing cost and producing more pounds. I know there are going to be people that are opponents to this, and uh, that's perfectly fine. If you don't feel comfortable using them, if you don't want to, I'm not going to. That's fine. I'm going to use the technologies that are available to us as a producer, um, and if you don't feel comfortable using them, that is okay.
Absolutely. You had a question here. Can you give implants to heifers? And I won't go through an exhaustive answer to that, but there are implants designed specifically for heifers that you might want to think about keeping as replacements later. And there's a lot of research on both sides, depending on how early you give that. What I would say is it would be just, I think, an easier thing to manage through, if you're worried about getting heifers to the weight they need to be at breeding. I prefer, as a reproductive physiologist, managing that without implants in developing heifers. But there are people that do it in ways to do that, depending on the age and which implants you use. So there's some other questions. There was one on here that I really liked, and maybe we'll let me ask this one next. Well, I may not be able to find it here quickly. Basically, the question in general was, what are some characteristics, Andrew, working with a lot of stocker operators, that you see in a successful stocker operator in general? Just kind of some approaches they use, or something you've noted about successful stocker operators.
Well, when it comes to stocker operators, the first thing that you know is that they know how to get cattle bought correctly. Because if buying cattle right, I mean, that's more than half the battle. That makes them half sold. But the best from production standpoint are people that know how to identify sickness quickly and effectively, and treat that sickness, and flexibility. Producers that are flexible in how they manage each group of cattle, because cattle are just like humans in the standpoint we're not all the same. They don't all do the same thing. And so, I'm fixing to have some help, some companies fixing to come in. But these animals are all different, and in each time of the year, that how you have to handle these cattle are a little different. And these cattle producers, these good stocker producers, tend to be flexible in how they manage each group of cattle. And they're good marketers. I mean, they end up being good marketers.
Got a ton of questions over here. I'm just trying to kind of curate. So kind of back on where can I find research on and statistics on growth promoting implants? I don't mean to dwell on that because we're kind of getting some chatter here about it, but there's a ton of research out there. Most all that I've seen, on the FDA and USDA clearance of it. Of course, if you kind of go into it, just wanting to support your own preconceived opinions of it, you can find whatever research you want to. But I'd be glad to have a discussion with anybody about that and present what I know about it, and be willing to be proved wrong if that's the case. I'm always open to that, because I've been that way a time or two myself. I had to pay for it before. Let's see. Got some more specific questions in here, maybe that we've already addressed as we went. So let's finish with this one, Andrew. There was a question, and this is kind of another hot topic, and actually, could get some pretty intense conversation if everybody was on here live and talking. But just talking about transparency in markets. The one I saw here in the Q&A box was specifically about local livestock markets and the number of buyers, maybe seeming to be in the person asking the question, their opinion that there wasn't as much competition there. And I know kind of the big thing in the news is how I saw one of them flash in there. One of the big things in the current news is that there's not a lot of transparency or competition on the far side of the market. So coming from feedlot to the packers, I know that's a loaded question for you, man, but anything you want to address on that, just market transparency, price discovery from any point in the marketing. And I'll just say before you start answering that, we're not talking about genetics in this session, but I think you just proved that maternal genetics are very strong, and that we all have hope if your kid is that cute.
My kids get it from their mother.
Yep.
So from a local perspective on price transparency, the auction markets that we have, whether that be a weekly auction market that cattle are sold through the ring or video auction, price transparency doesn't get any more transparent than that. Complete price discovery on animals. We had a similar system we still have some similar systems for finished cattle that actually go through a ring and are sold that way. The concern of many people is that we don't have enough price discovery. So actual negotiated cash trade of finished cattle. That is the big issue that our government thinks they need to intervene in. And there's a reason why the market has transitioned to the way it's transitioned. And that's because there are not a lot of places where it's not very efficient to run. I mean, when you're set 500,000 finished cattle a week, somebody has to buy those cattle and somebody has to sell those cattle. And these feedlots and these packers, they prefer to have an alternative marketing agreement in which they can use some type of formula to set prices, because it requires less labor. Otherwise, you take a feedlot that has to call several different packers, and then they had to start negotiating what prices should be. And that takes time, that takes effort, and that takes people. The packer has to do the same thing. And so typically what we see is these packers and these feedlots, and some people will call it vertical integration, even though it's not. There really are not that many packer-owned cattle anymore. JBS used to have JBS 5 Rivers, but they don't own that anymore. So there's really not that many packer-owned cattle. Tyson doesn't own any feedlots, but they have agreements with big feedlots on pricing a lot of cattle every week, because if you kill 6,000 a day, which would be a big plant, do you really have time to be negotiating prices on 6,000 head every week or every day to fulfill those needs? And so we have this limited amount of cash trade that people are concerned is not representative of what the market should be, because it ends up being what we call fill in, to fill in the gaps. Yes, we could benefit from more negotiated cash trade. The current legislation that was recently passed the House Ag Committee had to do with making the alternative marketing agreement information available to the public, which would increase price transparency on how those values are set. I do have tremendous concern in the government interfering and mandating a certain percentage of cattle be marketed via negotiated cash trade, because what that will do is increase the cost of trading cattle. And what that's going to end up doing is it's going to feed all the way back to the cow-calf producer, and you're going to pay the cost, because those other guys, they have their margins that they want to make, and that's what they're going to try to achieve. So that cost of that increased negotiated cash trade, because it's going to take more people, it's going to take the logistics, just make it tougher. But from a local standpoint on trading calves and feeder cattle, it is as transparent as it comes.
All right, Andrew, I'm kind of typing in some short answers to questions over here, but if there's anything else that you'd like to mention, just to kind of wrap us up here, I'll let you do that. But when you and I both sign off, I may keep it open just a minute to answer some more questions here on this. And if you want to do the same, you can, I think, pull them up on your end as well. But just any closing thoughts?
Well, no, just know that anybody on here, reach out to me if you have specific questions. I'll email me, call me, whatever it takes. Email is probably the best way, but please feel free to email me. I'll answer questions. I'll help you with your operation in whatever way I can. That's what you pay me to do.
All right, Andrew, I appreciate you being willing to be on this evening and give us some ideas about general marketing basics and answering some of these questions. And like I say, I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording and turn off my video and audio, and I'll just type a few answers here into some of these questions. But if I don't get a chance to answer your questions directly, like I said, there's some more discussion here on concern of some of the tools that we use in cattle production, and I think some pretty strong misconceptions of other uses of agricultural tools, which is pretty standard, I think, in today's society. But I just urge you to find real research on it instead of maybe social media or popular press type things, and dig into that. But at the end of the day, it's ultimately your decision, and we all certainly respect that. But again, Andrea, thank you. And I'm going to sign us off here, or at least I'll turn off my audio and video, and we'll answer a few more questions, and I'll shut it down. All right. Thanks, man.
Thanks, Justin.
All right, see you.